I am Silvia Bottiroli. I am an independent curator, researcher, and I'm currently based in Bologna, in Italy. I facilitated the workshop titled Collaboration in Context. And we started actually by reflecting a little bit on two words, which are practices and context, which we decided to use in plurals, or that I propose to use in plural. We focus on the word practice as a way to reflect on what we do and how we do things, and focusing on the fact that by doing and repeating certain things, we also reinforce certain structures. And by changing or stopping to do certain things or changing the way how we do, our work does other things. So maybe a bit on the performativity of the practice, if you like, and on the multiplicities of context. So in order to acknowledge that we are always operating within multiple contexts that range from the very tiny maybe context of a small organization to local context to transnational and global context. And there's an invitation to try to move a bit in this line between the very little and the very broad. Also taking with us, of course, some of the inputs and some of the maybe provocations or recommendations that came from the plenary session, in particularly in the understanding of our practices as part of or as contributing to a global world made by, let's say, yes, global exchanges between humans and maybe even more than human entities. And so maybe also that our overall responsibility as an art sector not being so much related to specific missions, but also to this understanding of us as a whole somehow. And maybe one other starting point that I think also came back a bit during the workshop was in this idea that it's not only about doing more or doing different things, but it's also about stopping doing certain things that we do or breaking the continuity of certain practices. So this was a little bit the start of it. As a form for the workshop, I propose to start by exchanging positive experiences. This is a methodology that comes from David Cooper, but that I learned via Lotte van den Berg, an artist and educator who proposed this to me in another setting, group setting, which basically is the idea on focusing on something that we remember and experienced as positive in terms of learning, and trying to dig a bit in depth and what made it important and why, rather than focusing on, let's say, negative experiences or what does not work. And this aimed to create a first collection also of possible practices indeed, or experiences that could be discussed and maybe implemented in other contexts or just analyzed as examples. In the workshop there were around 15 people coming from different countries, in different continents actually. I would say maybe a majority of people working or being based now in European countries, but also people from Chile, from South Africa, for example, and people bringing a lot of expertise also in relation to indeed transnational or international or global exchanges and perspectives. Also, the people in this group of people was made by people who work within institutions or organizations, but also independent artists, producers, or initiators of collective processes. I think all obviously probably busy at the same time with very local dynamics and dimensions, and also with very kind of transnational exchanges. And many people have the experience themselves of having moved from one country to another, or from one context to another more than once. I think this informed a lot the way how we talked about that. The practices that were exchanged were really a broad spectrum of practices or just moments and experiences. There is also maybe some that are staying more with me or that spoke more to me. Some are really kind of methods, so some people shared something that they developed over years as a way to react to certain situations where power relations are constructed in a certain way. Like, for example, something that was mentioned as turning around and talking to your neighbor when there is a clear power structure in how space is organized, in who has voice and who can speak, and that comes with the realization that this structure can also be broken just by creating another center of power or by acknowledging the agency that we have, and starting the conversation that matters for us in that moment, that does not necessarily refer to what is imposed as the topic or the way how we should do things. We discussed solidarity a lot, both in institutional contexts as, for example, in international networks, also questioning how to cooperate and collaborate together, acknowledging different situations, different access to resources, for example. Interestingly, we were discussing a lot the breakage and the discontinuity, so breaking habits or stopping doing certain things. But also another term that was brought to the discussion was maintenance. So what is it that we want to maintain? And somehow maintenance as also a very resilient attitude in the sense of reshaping and readapting to changing conditions all the time. It was other things that were discussed were forms of collaboration between partners, locally and transnationally, that have maybe different missions and different agendas. Transparency was an important word there. So positive experiences, for example, came from experiencing that everybody can be transparent about their own agenda, interests and needs for the collaboration, and therefore we can find each other and also accept that somehow we are invited for a specific reason and find our motivation of being there. Other people also brought our attention more towards, let's say, the local context that they work with. Like the kind of trans-local communities, and indeed how the practice is embedded in cities, in neighborhoods, in social contexts, by also creating practices of listening, for example, to local associations, to civic society organizations, in order, and some examples were shared that had to do with sharing agency within institutions, for example, like co-programming the theater in relation to an artistic community, or to co-programming in relation to associations and individuals who live in the neighborhood. The notion of the context was central, and I think indeed we decided, we agreed to discuss it as plural, so that we're not talking about one context, but by acknowledging the multiplicities of contexts, which means also the diversities of contexts, but also the multiplicity of contexts that each of us lives and goes through normally, was an important starting point. Also as a way maybe of relativizing certain agendas or missions that we have to deal with, and understanding that, yeah, that this is maybe about this local audience or local context, but also the transnational artistic community and the other way around. As one of the aims of the workshop was specifically to discuss how we can collaborate across different contexts, acknowledging diversities, differences and inequalities in the context of different conditions in terms of access, for example. And that was, I think, very much part of the conversation, like equality, the difference between equality and equity at some point was an important point of discussion. But also we discussed, for example, some practices that are implemented in some organization in order to create a permanent learning about discrimination and how to face it and fight it when it occurs. I think we tried also to keep the spectrum of context quite broad indeed. So to acknowledge that the differences in context also happens when we collaborate between people with a steady job and people who are freelancing, for example, so that precarity or working conditions are very different. And then it really goes and scales up to international and global collaboration between socio-political contexts that have the very different qualities, let's say. And maybe another thing that came very much from yesterday, and that was important, that felt important, is how we can take a posture which is not just a posture of resistance when difficulties occur in a context, but also a posture of somehow prefiguration or pre-imagination of something that might or might not happen, and working towards creating certain other conditions maybe that we would want to see. And I think it really stayed a bit there as more as an atmosphere in the room rather than something that we tackled really concretely.